Welcome to our lecture and discussion on what I consider to be one of the very best novels written by an American in the 20th century, and one of the best writers in the American canon, and that is Toni Morrison. You may know her from a lot of different sorts of works, Beloved, Sula, and a number of other shorter works. She's a poet as well. She actually was invited by Bill Clinton when he was inaugurated to read some of her poetry at the inauguration. And believe it or not, several years ago, she came to the TWU campus, and our students, including our honor students, had an opportunity to meet her as she did a reading from some of her works. It's kind of one of those once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. She has since sadly passed away, but will, I think, be remembered as one of the greats in American literature. And this novel, I think, is also, though it's very short, a real classic in the making. It takes years for something to become a classic, but I think year after year, even though it's a very difficult novel, people always say, well, can you give me a trigger warning? Well, I could, but at the same time, I think we have to engage works that are sometimes very disturbing. This one is. It deals with some very serious and some very sad topics or issues. We're going to dive into it, and I'm going to not be able to do this justice in the short format I have, but hopefully I'll offer enough sort of discussion threads so that each of you will have an opportunity to kind of weigh in on ideas or issues that I think are kind of are important within the novel. It's a very brief novel, as I said. A couple hundred pages is all it is, but it packs a very powerful punch. One of the things that people never do, and they really should when they read a novel, is if the author has written a foreword or an introduction, you got to read it, because that's the author telling you what she or he is trying to accomplish in the novel, or giving you at least some insight into how they approach their craft. And in this particular one, she's very upfront. She says that in some ways what she was trying to do, she didn't quite achieve the way she wanted. Some of the sort of experimentation that she was trying to do, she couldn't kind of pull off like she would like. All authors are going to say that, right? They're going to do that. But she gives you a true insight into what she's trying to accomplish, the big, big thing she's trying to accomplish in the novel, when she says things like, beauty was not simply something to behold, it was something one could do. Racial self-loathing is key in the novel, and we'll talk about that here in a few moments. She says, essentially, the damaging internalization of assumptions, of immutable inferiority originating in an outside gaze. Right? One of the things that Morrison does is she writes great lines. She's a poet, so she writes these wonderful lines, and the words sound terrific, but you have to slow down and really break those down, because they're sometimes a lot more powerful and profound than the first reading. The damaging internalization of assumptions, right? So you internalize assumptions about your unchangeable, that's what immutable means, inferiority, originating in an outside gaze. So what she's interested in the novel is what happens to people, a group of people or an individual, when somebody outside of them, because of the way they view them, create this internalizing feeling that I'm never going to be as good as somebody else, right? So, and that the damage that causes is what she wants to talk about. I focused, therefore, on how something as grotesque as the demonization of an entire race could take root inside the most delicate member of society. So this big issue, this cruel, this really terrible thing, how does it affect the most fragile and vulnerable member of that society? A girl who has been abused, who's a child, the most vulnerable member, a female, and trying to dramatize the devastation that even casual racial contempt can cause. I chose a unique situation, not a representative one. And she's very honest. Now, what does she mean by that? I chose a unique situation. I didn't choose this isn't everybody's experience. Okay? It's not everybody. It's not representative. but it's unique. It's like in the extreme. So she doesn't want people to come along and say, well, that's not how every kid is treated, even in segregated. Well, she says that. She's like, look, there are other characters in the book, okay? But she wants to make that impact there. And she says, I believed some aspects of her woundability were lodged in all young girls, right? And she's not just saying young black girls, but young girls in general. So it's not just a novel about race, although that's huge, obviously. It's about being a vulnerable member of society, and how do you escape unscathed? It's impossible. The terrible things that society permits, or has not yet at least conquered. She goes on to say, pitying her rather than into an interrogation of themselves for the smashing. My solution, break the narrative into parts that had to be reassembled by the reader, seemed to me a good idea, the execution of which does not satisfy me now, right? So she says, I tried a narrative experimentation where you kind of go back and forth with different perspectives, chapter to chapter. She said, I tried that. I don't think it works really well now that I've written it. Besides, it didn't work. Many readers remain touched but not moved. That's big. What do you mean touched but not moved? Again, break her words down. It's very important. Many readers remain touched but not moved. What is the difference between being touched and being moved? I would suggest that being touched is feeling an emotional response. Being moved is moved to do something, moved to change. I don't know. You decide that. But she's very precise in her language, and I wouldn't. Speaking of precise in her language, most of you guys are way too young to remember. Not unlike Dr. Litton here, who was born, like I said, back when Benjamin Franklin was around. Evidently, I'm getting old. When I was a kid in grammar school, we used what were called Dick and Jane books. Now you can look them up and Google them. I highly recommend you doing them. Picture over there on the right of a character. They did a play of a dramatic version of it, of the students' use of the Dick and Jane books, okay? And Dick and Jane books were early readers, first grade, second grade readers, right? And they used, different sentence structures to help people establish vocabulary and spelling and how to write and how to read, right? See Dick run, see Jane run, see Dick and Jane run, Dick and Jane run fast. Right? And so they had like a dog named Spot and a cat named Puff or something like that. But here's the thing. They presented a kind of idealized middle-class lifestyle. They came out in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I don't remember. Obviously, I used them when I was in grade school, late 60s, early 70s. We're still being used. I don't think they use them at all anymore. But guess what? Everybody in the book was white. Everybody in the book lived a perfect middle-class life. Nothing bad ever happened. Maybe Spot would get lost and they would have to go find him, but everything always ended well, right? Okay. So it was this idyllic lifestyle and everything. And we get to hear this mostly from Claudia's perspective. And Claudia early on lets you know that, she's quite self-aware. She knows that there are some things about her that she doesn't like, and there are some things about her that she does that people don't really understand. Everybody at the time idealizes sort of white Hollywood culture. And Shirley Temple is considered to be the great, ideal child, the beautiful little blonde-haired, well-mannered, white kid with blue eyes who dances and she's such a cute little baby doll, etc. And all the little girls wanted dolls for gifts, Christmas and birthday and whatnot. And if they got a doll, they just loved it, right? And they took good care of it. Well, not Claudia, because Claudia basically says, I didn't like the little doll that I got for Christmas. I didn't like that. And in fact, it talked, and it was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed doll. It seems strange to us, but, ethnically diverse baby dolls and Barbie dolls are honestly relatively new. Back in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, you didn't see an awful lot of diversity when it came to ethnicity or race or anything like that when it came to toys. It was very white. And I think they just either didn't think, I doubt it was by design so much, but it was just they didn't think. The people who are in charge of these companies just didn't think that way. Just like the Dick and Jane books. They were probably written by white people for what they perceived to be a mostly white country, and they didn't think about other people. But that nevertheless, that has that marginalizing effect, that effect of feeling I'm not part of the mainstream culture. I don't count. My experience doesn't count. Claudia gets a baby doll like that, and it talks or what have you, and the first thing she wants to do is to tear it apart. She wants to see where the voice comes from. Now, voice is an important thing, right? Because number one, we hear a lot of different voices in the novel, but when we say voice, we don't just mean talking. Sometimes we mean like our power to speak, the importance of what we have to say. When we say, Joe was shy, but eventually he got his voice. What we mean by that is something different than, I could hear him talking, right? It's something different. It's something more than that. So when she says this baby doll had a voice, it spoke, and she decides she wants to dig into it, rip it apart, and find out what made it what it is. And when she wants to look into its eyes and ask the question, why is this child, the way it looks, considered to be the ideal standard of beauty, and people like me are not? Why? What makes it? What is the essence of that desirability? Because I don't feel that for her. I don't want to be her. In fact, I resent that. Why did she win the lottery of life in that way, and no one celebrates my beauty? No one celebrates the beauty of people who look like me or from my neighborhood or from my culture. Why is that? Why am I excluded, is what she's kind of getting at. And of course the adults look at her and say, what an ungrateful child. She tears her toys up and she's a bad kid, etc. Okay, so that I'm singling in on that because that one sort of episode brings in lots of different aspects of themes that eventually run through the entire novel. And I'm just going to pull out 4 of them that are important that I want you to keep your eyes on. And we're going to talk about those in as much as I can here in the brief time that we have. First, the theme of alienation, that feeling that I'm different, we are different. People in my neighborhood or in my family are different, and we're not accepted. We're not part of the mainstream. There's the kid named Maureen, who is an interracial child, and her father, I believe this is the child whose father won a lawsuit against an ice cream company or something, and she's got nicer clothes and all this kind of stuff. So the question of how marginalized you are within a group of people who are considered on the outside of mainstream society. If you're younger, some of this will make sense to you intellectually, but it may not be part of your particular generation's experience the way it was very much the part of Toni Morrison's experience growing up. I hear a lot of people talk about, how important social justice is today, and I get that. That's true. But we forget sometimes that people Morrison's generation lived in a really, really different world. It was really different. I'm an old guy, and I barely remember as a child going into a drugstore in Little Rock, Arkansas, where I grew up, and seeing a whites-only and colored water fountains, right? 2 different water fountains. And I didn't read at the time. I wasn't able to read because I was a little kid. I was probably about 3 years old or so. And I just went to the water fountain and drank out of it. And the store manager told my mother he can't drink out of that. He needs to go drink out of the... Evidently, I had drank out of the colored fountain. Okay. This was mid 60s, 64, 65. And my mother had a fit, blew a gasket, and said, you shouldn't even have that up here. Okay. You're not supposed to have that, because by that time, the Civil Rights Act and all that kind of stuff, that desegregation that was he wasn't supposed to still have 2 different water fountains, okay? I'm 3 or whatever my age is. I don't remember. I just remember the scene and just barely in my memory, and then knowing later that my mother told me it was because he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do. He was supposed to get rid of that. You're supposed to only have 1 water fountain, etc. So if you're younger than I am, and I'm guessing almost all of you are, because almost everybody is, you have no memory of that. I barely have a memory of that. But think about the world that Toni Morrison had to live in, and her characters, Claudia and those, and what they had to live in. and how important, how much that made you feel alienated. Another theme, freedom. And by the way, I put it in quotation marks because, of course, everyone wants freedom. And in the African American community, that has been the driving sort of feeling or force, the need for freedom because of enslavement for centuries. But Morrison explores the dangerous side of freedom. Look at Charlie Breedlove, and Charlie has to be kind of a shortening of Charlie. It's probably his official name was probably Charlie, but everybody calls him Charlie. He has a sort of freedom that is self-destructive and dangerous, right? That's so don't just think of freedom as a positive thing. That's the way we usually think of things, is freedom being positive. Freedom can also have a dark side to it. It can be the freedom to destroy oneself and even others. It can be unbridled freedom. It can be anarchy or darkness. And then, of course, returning back to the foreword, a major theme is racial constructs. And by what I mean by that is how people construct a view of race, either for themselves or for other people, or how a society does that, and self-loathing. And I think Morrison's kind of striking. It's not just a novel about baby dolls. It's a novel about what is, because Charlie and Piccola both suffer. Now, it's really hard once you've read the novel to have much sympathy for Charlie, okay? And I get that, and I don't either in some ways. But in some other ways, any great character, any complex character, even if it's a villain, even if it's a person who does terrible, terrible things, if a writer is great, she can write that she can create that character in a way where we can also see a few things that we either sympathize with or feel sorry for, or in some ways admire. Right? That's because people are complex creatures. Even people like Charlie who do terrible things, you can't help but feel sorry for them. I'm skipping ahead here, but let me go ahead and say another theme is the impact of time and place on our lives, because Claudia is writing this in retrospect as a young woman, we think, or at least as an adult, if not a young adult, certainly an adult, and looking back and trying to make sense out of her childhood. We all do this. We all look back and try to make sense out of our childhood or about our previous experiences, especially if those experiences were tragic or traumatic. Okay? So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the Breedloves here, especially Charlie, his childhood, how he was kind of dropped off on the doorstep and raised by a woman who was not his mother. She took care of him, good care of him, but she dies. And he is essentially kind of has to raise himself in some way. A scarring episode for him is the humiliation in the woods where he is making love to a girl that he had met. Be as judgmental as you want to, whatever. But they're young and they're in love, or they're at least really attracted to each other. And, young people do what young people do. Okay. But the horribly cruel thing is that these men come up to him, the white men with lanterns, and they humiliate and degrade both of them. And essentially they sort of emasculate him by making him complete the sex act. After which he is disgusted by and angered at the girl, who I believe is named Deborah. Can't recall right now. She's not really a prominent figure in the novel, is in so much as she's largely just an object of his loathing. And so he takes it out on her. Psychologists would call this misplaced aggression. Call it what you want. But essentially, they've destroyed his sense of masculinity and manhood, made him do something that was degrading, and took something that was supposed to be beautiful and pleasurable and sweet, okay? And made him perform for them, and he hates her for that. You might say, that's terribly unfair. I know, but human beings who are traumatized do irrational things. And it was a terrible thing, but he does treat her that way. He goes about seeking his father. He eventually, we think, finds his father. least we are led to assume that it really is his father that he finds, and is rejected by his father. And it's so traumatic that he defecates on himself and goes into essentially a catatonic state where he can't move for hours until he finally comes to, and afterwards becomes this free, in quotation marks, soul who has no qualms about hurting anybody to get whatever he wants in life, because he feels, I have been damaged by life, I have been wounded by life, this is grossly unfair, and I'm going to go do what I want to do. He marries Mrs. Breedlove, Pauline. They have a child. Child is Pecola. The rape scene is a horrific thing. We're led to believe he does it more than once, right? Because we find that out towards the end of the novel through Pecola's own recollection. She becomes a sort of split personality. If that's confusing to you, that's why, is because she's talking to herself, basically. She's no longer saying whatever you want to say. But he rapes her. And again, it's not a crime of sexual passion or desire. It's a crime of loathing. He even says, and what makes it so doubly disgusting and disturbing is that he doesn't do it because he just feels like he's in the mood for sex or something like that. He doesn't. He does it because he despises his own daughter. To think that one would despise your own offspring because, the novel says this, it's because he couldn't do for her what other people could do for their child. It's because he couldn't be a success for her. It's because he couldn't help her. That she was so pathetic because of him, he felt. That my daughter is this despicable creature because I'm such a crappy person and I can't give her any more. Remember, he's the kind of guy who buys a sofa, it arrives ripped, and he has no recourse for that. They've stripped the dignity from the man. He can't even stand up for himself, because if he does and he takes it out on the furniture guy, what's going to happen in that day and age? Somebody's going to come to his door and they're going to take him out and they're going to beat him or worse. So he has no rights. He has no ability to improve his family's lot. And he looks at his child and says, the child is her pathetic nature. And I don't mean that in a mean sense, okay? Because she is pathetic in the sense that you feel for her, okay? Her pathetic situation or circumstance he sees as the result of him, right? I'm a crappy person. Life has dealt me a bad blow because I'm not even able to improve my child's lot in life. And again, define it the way you wish or explain it the way you wish, sexual violence and sexual aggression being an attempt to exert control or dominate. He does what he does, and it's a terrible thing. And he feels terrible for it afterwards, but clearly he does it again. So how are we to see him? We're to see him as this complex figure who is, a mixture of somebody that you just wish you could have gotten to earlier in life, who's done some terrible things, committed murders is what we're led to believe, but also and who's done some terrible things to his wife. His relationship with his wife, holy mackerel, boy, is that one for the textbooks, isn't it? She lives this escapist world where she lives a fantasy life through the movies, pretending that she could be part of a family that she really is only a servant for. They give her a nickname. They call her Polly. Here's a funny thing. In life, it is true, I think, Morrison's onto something when she says this, that if you're given a nickname, someone cared enough to notice you, right? If you're never given a nickname, is it because you didn't want one, maybe? Maybe you live in a very formal family, or it could simply be that this is somebody that nobody got to know well enough to give them a nickname. And she seems to have been that kind of person because, of course, her leg situation, or foot situation, I'm sorry. And she was kind of an overlooked person. And they live in a dingy storefront, frankly. Charlie drinks all the time. They get into whales of fights. And there's this wonderfully revealing but disturbing passage or two where essentially the worst thing that could happen to Pauline is if Charlie actually did reform himself, because she feels righteous because he is this unrighteous foil. She feels that, she feels good about herself because she's at least not him. And the fights they have are brutal and vicious fights, physical fights, where she is glad to be beating him because she feels she's beating the evil out of the world, because he is the epitome of evil in her eye. It's a really sick relationship. It's really terrible. She grows to love the children of the people she is a housekeeper for more than her own child, which is terrible. We see this with the pie, or cobbler, I should say. And so all of this comes to a head as the novel progresses, and we see what eventually ends up happening to Piccola, because Charlie loses it, burns the house down, and is not seen anymore, and now Piccola has to be placed with someone else, and it's with Claudia's family that we eventually find that to be the case. I'm going to stop here and continue on with the next video.